The Zheen did not have a word for I, but they had 17 words for we, each precise to the number, duration, and quality of connection. A Zheen soldier in combat existed in the seventh state, we of immediate purpose, minds interlocked like fingers in a fist. Intention flowed from strategist to commander to warrior without friction, without doubt, without the delay of speech. When Commander of 7,000 raised its perception across a battlefield, it did not merely see the field. It was the field. It was the dust and the angle of the sun and the 7,000 heartbeats of its unit all at once, a vast and humming coherence. Commander of 7,000 had led conquests across 6 worlds in 40 years of expansion. It had never encountered an enemy it could not read. Reading was not the correct term, any more than a fish might be said to read water. The intentions of organic minds were simply present, available as heat or cold. Every species the Zheen had encountered broadcast the same essential architecture. Fear, the suppression of fear, calculation of odds, the targeting of weapons. Predators telegraphed aggression. Prey telegraphed flight. Even the most sophisticated empires the Zheen had dismantled had fallen not to superior firepower, but to the fundamental weakness of isolated consciousness. That every individual mind, thinking alone, was legible, was knowable, was already defeated by the time it acted. To fight the Zheen was to announce your defeat in advance, to perform your own checkmate with every considered move. When a human army appeared at the Seveth Ridge on the 4th day of the Karanath campaign, Commander of 7,000 felt them immediately. Not as a threat, not as a coherent military formation, as an anomaly. It extended its perception across the kilometer of broken terrain between the forces. Expecting the familiar architecture, mammalian aggression, the cold architecture of trained soldiers suppressing animal fear, weapon targeting, tactical calculation. It found, instead, sandwich. This was the first coherent word shape that emerged from the consciousness of the humans called Marcus Okafor, a platoon sergeant with 11 years of service and a scar through his left eyebrow that his mother had never stopped worrying about. He was observing the Zheen position through field glasses. The word sandwich existed in his mind simultaneously with the tactical assessment. 3 hostiles northwest, elevated position, exposed flank, and simultaneously with a memory of his best friend Dominic's wedding invitation that he had not yet answered despite the RSVP date having passed 3 weeks ago, and simultaneously with a tune he had heard in a bar on Karanath Station that he could not stop humming despite having no idea of the title or the language it was sung in, and simultaneously with a sudden vivid recollection of the specific sweet smell of his grandmother's kitchen on Sunday mornings in Lagos, and simultaneously with a calculation of whether it was worth mentioning the sandwich thought to anyone, and simultaneously with the awareness that he would not, and simultaneously with the decision to act. Commander of 7,000 experienced all of this at once, not sequentially, not as layers to be peeled, as co-presence. Each thought occupied the same mental space with equal intensity, none subordinated to purpose. It was like trying to read a symphony by listening to every instrument separately and simultaneously and finding that none of them was the melody. Marcus lowered his glasses. 3 hostiles, northwest. Jennifer, you got that ridge? Got it, Jennifer Reyes said. She was already moving, her body executing training while her mind, Commander of 7,000, reached for it with the ease of 7 decades of practice and found. I need a sharper knife for the tomatoes. Dad always said a dull blade was more dangerous. Dad's hands were always so certain when he cooked. Why are my hands shaking right now? Is it because I'm not him? Is it because I left? Is it because he died while I was deployed and I never learned his recipe for the eggs with the peppers that he made on Sundays? Is it because she reached the first covered position? Check her left flank. Advanced. Is it because I could still go back? Is it because the house is still there? Is it because Miguel asked me once if the military was really what I wanted and I said yes, and I meant it then, but now? She reached the second position. Weapon raised. Eyes clear. Commander of 7,000 reached for the 3rd human. The one called Diego Vasquez, a corporal who had twice been recommended for promotion and twice declined it for reasons that remained opaque to his chain of command, and found him calculating firing trajectories while simultaneously experiencing a detailed fantasy involving a person he had seen on a recruitment poster in the transit hub on Deck 7, while also reviewing everything he remembered about a documentary on octopus neural architecture that he had watched 18 months ago and not been able to stop thinking about, while also wondering if he was a bad person for thinking about sex during active combat, while also remembering that he had told his abuela he would call her last Thursday and had not, while also experiencing a sharp flicker of guilt about the documentary thought because it seemed irrelevant and irrelevance felt like failure, while also, always also, never arriving at a single, graspable, predictable intention. Commander of 7,000 released its perception. It stood for a fraction of a second, a long time for a Zheen in combat, processing what it had encountered. The Zheen had evolved telepathy as a survival mechanism on a world that had produced 4 competing apex predators. Prey that announced its intentions could be caught. Predators that could not read each other, could not coordinate. Over 100,000 years of evolution, the Zheen had built civilization on the bedrock of perfect mutual legibility, a society in which every thought was, in principle, shared. They had no crime, no betrayal, no politics, no need for art, because art was the technology of imagining another's interior, and they did not need to imagine what they could simply know. And so they had no framework for what Marcus and Jennifer and Diego were broadcasting. The humans were not concealing their intentions. They were not trained to shield their thoughts. They were simply, catastrophically, too much, transmitting on every frequency simultaneously, none of the signals resolving into prediction, all of them real, all of them present, all of them equally immediate. It was not a tactical deception. It was not a weapon. It was just how they were. Advance, commander of 7,000 ordered. Its soldiers hesitated. In 70 years of combined combat experience, they had never hesitated. Diego moved left without knowing why. He was vaguely aware that he had separated from the squad formation, that Marcus was shouting something into the comm that got eaten by terrain interference, that there was a Zheen soldier, 7 feet of chitinous gray, and tinny flat with what he'd been briefed was aggression, directly in his path around the boulder field. But he was also thinking about octopuses. He'd been thinking about octopuses a lot since that documentary. How they had decentralized nervous systems. How 2/3 of their neurons weren't in their brains at all. They were distributed through their arms, so that each arm could taste and decide and react without the central brain's permission. An octopus arm could solve a maze after being severed. An octopus could be said, in some technical sense, to have 8 minds or no mind, depending on how you define the word. And wasn't that sort of what he was doing now? His body was tasting the terrain, the angle of the scree, the shadow of the boulder, and deciding without his conscious permission to roll left, to come up behind cover, to fire 3 shots that coincidentally matched the rhythm of the song from Deck 7 that none of them knew the name of. His mind was watching this happen with a kind of impressed attachment, the way you watch someone else solve a problem you hadn't recognized as a problem yet. He wondered if octopuses ever felt lonely. He realized the Zheen soldier was down. He was not certain when that had happened. He reported his position to Marcus and reloaded and moved to the next covered position, and the whole time the back of his mind was composing, in fragments, the opening line of the call he owed his abuela. Abuela, I know, I'm sorry, I've been meaning to... Jennifer reached the ridge. She came up slow and low, the way her instructor had drilled into her until it was reflex, until her body knew the shape of the movement even when her mind was elsewhere. And her mind was mostly elsewhere. She had been thinking about the eggs since the mission briefed. Her father's eggs, specifically, the ones with the red peppers and the cumin, the ones that existed only in her memory now, because she had never learned to make them and the person who knew the recipe was in the ground in Guadalajara. Below her, the Zheen position was exposed at precisely the angle the sergeant had needed. She could see 7 of them, maybe 8, and their commander, she didn't know it was the commander, standing slightly apart from the others, its antennae raised, its posture suggesting something she could not name. It looked up at her. Something in the way it stood, the particular angle of its weight, the stillness of it, reminded her of her father the day she left for basic training. The way he had stood in the doorway, not speaking, not stopping her, his face doing something complicated that she had never had the right word for, that she had filed under proud, but also, and never finished the sentence. She fired. She was crying. She didn't know exactly why. The Zheen were retreating. She could see it, the synchronized precision of 6 worlds of conquest coming apart like a flock of starlings hit by a hawk, their coordination breaking into something jagged and wrong. And she was thinking about how she had never learned the eggs, how she had always burned the onions when she tried, how maybe if she had stayed home she would have learned, how maybe if she had stayed he would have had someone there, how maybe if she had stayed. Cease fire. Marcus was shouting over the comm, cease fire, they are pulling back. Jennifer ceased fire. Her magazine was empty anyway. She sat on the ridge with her rifle across her knees and watched the Zheen withdraw across the broken flats of the Karanath Valley. They moved like a machine with stripped gears, still moving but wrong. Their famous formation consciousness visible now only in fragments. Individual soldiers colliding and separating where before there would have been seamless flow. One of them, not the commander, one of the line soldiers, was making a sound as it ran. She would remember this later, in dreams and in the psychiatric debriefs, and once in the middle of a quiet dinner that she would have to excuse herself from. A sound like a radio caught between stations, like a mind desperately trying to tune itself to a frequency that had never existed. Commander of 7,000 retreated in the 9th state. We of damage assessment, but the assessment would not cohere. The damage was not the 512 dead. The Zheen had lost more in worse terrain for worse reasons. Death was a subtraction, a known quantity, a thing the 9th state was designed to process. The damage was that Commander of 7,000 could not construct a model of what had defeated them. It assembled its surviving officers in the 9th state and relayed what it had perceived, and they received it and processed it and sent back the only response that made sense. Verify. It had to be misperception, some form of psychic shielding, some technology that scrambled intention reading the way certain minerals scrambled communication signals. Verify, they said. But Commander of 7,000 had been reading minds for 70 years. It knew what shielding felt like, the telltale blankness, the deliberate suppression. What it found in Marcus and Jennifer and Diego was not blankness. It was not suppression. It was everything, all at once, unshielded, unashamed, cacophonous. It was the most complete openness it had ever encountered, and it was completely unreadable. The concept kept returning. That one word from the tactical briefing it had intercepted. A human word. First person singular. The briefing had noted. Individual self-reference. The Zheen had cataloged it academically, the way you might note that some primitive species communicated through color change. Interesting. Inefficient. Irrelevant. It had not occurred to Commander of 7,000 to wonder what it would feel like to be a single eye. What it would mean to have a mind that was yours and only yours, that could hold sandwich and grief and tactical assessment and sexual fantasy and evolutionary curiosity all at once, all without hierarchy, none of it transmitted, none of it legible to anything outside the self. It tried to imagine it now. It cannot. It had no framework. For the first time in its existence, it found itself fabricating, trying to construct a model of human cognition by inventing a coherence that wasn't there, imposing narrative on chaos, telling itself a story about these creatures just to survive the encounter with their minds, making something up in order to understand. The Zheen had no art. They had never needed it. Commander of 7,000 was, without knowing it, practicing. The report reached the Zheen Coordinated Sovereignty 6 weeks later. It traveled through the We of long-distance relay. The 14th state, rarefied and exhausting, minds stretched thin across the light years like copper wire, and landed in the consciousness of the high We like a stone dropped in still water. The ripples did not stop. The high We had 1,700 members, their minds interlocked in the most refined communion the Zheen had achieved, a state so far from individual experience that the question of who was thinking any given thought had ceased to be meaningful. They processed the report from Commander of 7,000 in 0.4 seconds, which was a very long time for the high We. They had no word for what happened next. Later, much later, someone would invent one. The closest translation is the seam. Not a crack, not a break. A seam, the place where two pieces of fabric are joined and you can, if you look closely, see that they were once separate. For the first time in 11,000 years of Zheen civilization, the members of the High, we became aware of each other as each other. Not as extensions of a unified mind, as presences, distinct, adjacent, touching, but separate. It lasted 0.4 seconds. It was enough. The second engagement came 3 months later at the Porth Crossing, and the Sovereignty sent commander of 7,000 specifically, because it was the only military mind that had encountered the humans and survived with enough coherence to report. The Sovereignty had prepared. They had drilled their soldiers in resistance techniques, methods for narrowing attention, for filtering perception, for treating the human noise as static to be endured rather than signal to be read. They had studied the briefing materials. They believed they understood the problem. They did not understand the problem. The humans had brought more soldiers this time, 700 of them, under a colonel named Adiz Nwosu who had grown up in Enugu and had a philosophy degree she never used and a habit of working through tactical problems by thinking about something else entirely and waiting for her subconscious to deliver the answer. Her soldiers had been briefed. The Zheen red minds maintain noise discipline, don't try to think tactically. The briefing had been, in the assessment of everyone who received it, mostly useless because you cannot instruct a human consciousness to stop being a human consciousness. And the soldiers had responded to don't think tactically by thinking about everything else in the world with increased enthusiasm. Commander of 7,000 extended its perception and received. Private Amara Osei, reciting the periodic table from memory because her sergeant had told her it helped, while also wondering if the sergeant had ever actually tried it, while also composing a letter to her sister that she would probably never send, while also noticing that the light on Karanath at this hour looked remarkably like the light on late summer afternoons at home, while also Corporal Yuki Tanaka, trying to remember the name of her elementary school's janitor, a man who had been inexplicably kind to her when she was 9 years old, a man she had not thought of in 15 years, now suddenly vivid. Sergeant First Class Tomas Guerrero, internally debating whether a hot dog was a sandwich, a debate he had been having with himself on and off for 20 years, a debate that had achieved new urgency since the mess hall on Karanath Station had started serving something that was either a very bad hot dog or a very unusual sandwich, and nobody could agree. Withdraw, commander of 7,000 sent. Verify, the highway sent back. Hold position. Engage. Understand. Commander of 7,000 held position. It watched the humans advance. Watched their formation, which should have been tactically predictable, standard flanking pattern, textbook stuff, and found that the textbook could not survive contact with the individuals executing it. Diego Vasquez moved to a position that was technically wrong, and then was right, and there was no way to predict the transition because the decision had emerged from somewhere beneath the architecture tactics, from the part of him that was thinking about his abuela and octopus arms and the song from Deck 7. Jennifer Reyes fired from an angle that the Zheen defensive model had assessed as suboptimal and was not. Colonel Nwosu, on the high ground, drank cold coffee and thought about Wittgenstein and waited. The battle lasted 40 minutes. The Zheen lost 800 soldiers in the crossing. Commander of 7,000 retreated for the second time, and this time a ninth state felt different. The damage assessment was running, but underneath it, braided through the collective processing, was something that had no name in any of the 17 we states. Later, the historians would call it doubt. But it was more than that. It was the first awareness, dim and terrible, that there were forms of mind the Zheen could not encompass. That the universe contained an interior they could not access. That somewhere on the other side of that noise, the sandwiches and the grief and the octopuses and the eggs with peppers, there were singular beings, each of them an entire world, each of them opaque, each of them making decisions that were in the most fundamental sense free. The concept of I was the first symptom. It appeared in the military units that had engaged the humans, spreading from commander of 7,000's officers to their subordinates, carried not as a deliberate thought, but as a residue, a static clinging to the we states after contact. An interference, a ghost frequency. Soldiers would reach for the seventh state, we of immediate purpose, and find it slightly less total than it had been. Not broken, not absent, but edged. The way a photograph is edged with a border that says, "This is where it ends," and something else begins. The sovereignty responded with studied calm. This was a battlefield phenomenon, a psychological stress response. The we states would stabilize after sufficient rest and distance from the anomaly. The humans were a curiosity, a tactical problem to be solved, not an existential one. But the disease, if it was a disease, did not respect the sovereignty's assessment. It spread through the relay networks, the way all Zheen thought spread, carried on the long-distance communion that was the circulatory system of their civilization. It reached worlds that had never seen a human. It found, in the minds of Zheen philosophers and engineers and historians who had spent their entire lives in perfect we communion, a tiny resonant cavity where the concept could hum. I. What would I be? If I were not also you, what would I be? The sovereignty convened emergency sessions. They diagnosed the phenomenon. They proposed remedies. They acted with the speed and coordination that only a true collective mind can achieve to contain the spread. And in the very act of convening and diagnosing and proposing and acting, the 1,700 members of the High We thought, not together, not quite, but alongside each other, and noticed the difference and could not unfeel it.